Hello, everybody. How are we doing? Back once again post Austria, and the dust has just about settled on what was a ridiculous end to the Austrian Grand Prix. I had a lot of people in the chat going, it's another boring Max Verstappen victory in Austria, looking like it's done and dusted. Very quickly turned around at the end, but we are joined by Liam Talks Motorsport today, possibly the most knowledgeable Formula One fan I know. I know Formula One up to kind of, the early 2000s. Your knowledge of like the 90s, 80s, 70s is just absolutely ridiculous, mate. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the compliments. But yeah, great to be here.
It's absolutely incredible to have you on. And I mean, we have to dive straight into it. It's the talking point that everybody is going to have post weekend. Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, they both looked incredibly quick all weekend. We kind of had a little inkling that there might be a little battle between them in the sprint race. Then it came to the actual Grand Prix and it was just fireworks.
Yeah, I mean, Verstappen dominated the first period of the race, but
Mhm.
then he started to suffer with all sorts of problems getting through. The Haas's, I think, were a big catalyst in the battle because obviously they had some absolutely brilliant pace and they were keeping up with Verstappen and they were making sure that he couldn't pull away from them. They were keeping up with him because they obviously wanted to stay on the lead lap because everybody wants to stay on the lead lap in a Formula One race because it's a bit embarrassing to be a lap down. Um, and because of that, Lando was able to catch up a little bit. Plus, different pace on different tires, McLaren being good on their tires. And the second half of the race was just mental. And I think that after qualifying, I don't think anybody was expecting it to be as close as it was. Because, I mean, the sprint showed that Red Bull were quicker than McLaren and raced him over a certain period of time. But obviously, the sprints are only, third or so of the Grand Prix distance.
Yeah.
So you don't get a true inkling until the proper race because different teams can be quick in quality trim and race trim and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
I, the last period of the race was very, very good.
Well, for me, it was that middle stint where I kind of gave up hope a little bit. I was like, oh, okay, both on the hard compound tire now. Max Verstappen still quicker. I think that gap got up to about 8 seconds between Verstappen and Norris at one point. And as a McLaren fan, I was, hoping and praying that Lando Norris would be able to do something, but it just seemed like it had escaped away. And then, as you said, it was the Hasses that really did us a favor. Nico Hulkenberg keeping Max Verstappen honest, but also really uncharacteristic from Red Bull, a really poor pit stop. Like, that's something that we
Ye-
just expect from Red Bull to be stunning. Like, I say it almost every week at this point. I'm just like, Red Bull, pit stops, strategy, they're always right on it. But it seemed like, I don't know, because Max Verstappen's first pit stop was perfect. He came out in a little bit of room, had the track to himself, could kind of run into it a little bit. Second pit stop, slow, poor pit stop overall, because then it came out, as you said, under pressure from the Hasses. And all of a sudden, the whole complexion of the race changed. Like, that was really uncharacteristic from Red Bull.
Yeah. I was speaking to obviously before we started, and I said that he sort of had a sort of Murphy's Law thing. And if you don't know what Murphy's Law is, it's anything that can go wrong does go wrong at a certain time. And that is exactly what happened to Verstappen. Now, part of that was his own undoing, because obviously him and Lando, as we'll get into, were both acting like a bunch of teenagers, like the sort of
Yeah.
stuff you see in Formula 3 and Formula 4. I compared it, I was in a group chat and I was comparing it to, like a couple of Sennas being on the track, because that is exactly what it was
Yeah.
like, if you've seen clips of Senna. And yeah, the pit stop was dreadful. Red Bull have been, I think, for the past 4 or 5 years, 5 years probably, it's been 2019 is probably when they started to be good at them. They've been the best team at pit stops. Nobody's been better than them.
Oh,
McLaren's probably the only one that's been anywhere near them. They've been in a different league. So much so the FIA tried to stop them with the restrictions, but
yeah.
they've gone back to the old speeds. It's crazy that, first the first stint went so well for Verstappen. He was, as you say, 8 seconds up the road, good pit stops, good pace. Lando didn't have much of a response for him, apart from the one lap on, I think it was the second lap of the race where he was quicker than him. I think most laps after that, Verstappen was quicker than him, and Lando just could not do anything. And then Murphy's Law came into effect, and the battle began.
All happened. And that was the thing, wasn't it? It was a couple of things. Obviously, we talked from Max Verstappen's side of things, the things that went wrong for Red Bull, the things that went right for Lando Norris and McLaren. They had that fresh set of medium tyres. Their pit stop was fine. As you say, McLaren have been up there in terms of the pit stops as well. And it just closed that gap. And as soon as Lando Norris was kind of 2 seconds behind Verstappen after the pit stops, it felt like the race was kind of on, didn't it? And it was like, okay, Lando Norris is starting to close that gap. And it got very, very close. Like, it was within that half second. And then Lando started to go for the moves. And we saw him try a few different tactics. We saw him kind of
Yeah.
cut up the inside of turn 3, go on the outside of turn 3. Some very good defending from Max Verstappen to begin with. But all of that goes out the window when they come together. And what was your first instinct when you saw both cars go into turn 3? Norris kind of just trying to dart as much as he could. Max Verstappen coming across. Where did you think that incident kind of fell blame?
Well, can I just very quickly say, I was watching the race with my girlfriend, and I was saying to her, Lando needs to take that outside line because it's the best chance he's got because he'll get more acceleration, and that's the closest he got. But on the incident, I instantly knew as soon as I saw the incident that Max was at fault because Lando is as far to the left as he really can be, and he's taking that line because it nearly worked for him the time before, as I mentioned, where he was side by side with Max, heading into the corner almost into turn number 4 or 5, and yeah, I just knew instantly like that Max was more to blame for that particular incident because it's pretty difficult for Lando to be able to turn into him. And then when you see the replays, you see Lando's steering wheel barely moves.
Yeah.
And that, by automation, by proxy, makes Verstappen guilty because if Lando doesn't move, then who? It's not a gust of wind,
Yeah.
you know?
Someone's got to make
Max
that collision
obviously
happen.
exactly. It's not like, that's not how physics works. And I barely, I didn't even get I got a nat 4 in science. So, and that was general science. But anyway, yeah, you could tell based on the incident that it was more Max's fault for that particular instance. But over the whole thing, it was both of them acting like a bunch of kids.
I did think that as well. Yeah, it was both drivers, and they were constantly on the radio. I think that was the thing for me. We see Max Verstappen complaining about GP getting on the radio in the braking, and Lando Norris constantly telling his engineer to be quiet. And yet, the entire time, they were like, Max did this, Norris did this, he did that. And it was just like, can we, just focus on the racing. You two are both, to and fro. And as he said, it was gonna happen at some point. I think George Russell even said it in the cool down room, that he was expecting something to happen between the two of them. Lando Norris looked very racy after the sprint. I think he was a little bit frustrated not to get that win in Spain. And therefore, there was just that little bit of tension. It's what we need in Formula One, though. It does add to the drama, the excitement. And it was inevitable that it was going to happen. It was just a shame that when it happened, it was so catastrophic. We could have seen, a little bump of wheels, maybe Lando Norris still take the lead. Instead, what we saw was a massive amount of damage to both cars because punctures on Max Verstappen's car, then the puncture on Lando Norris's car, those tyres just shredding themselves to pieces. And, I mean, in the end, it led to Lando Norris having to retire from the Grand Prix. Do you kind of, from Lando Norris's perspective, do you understand why he got out of the car? He probably could have continued, would have finished in 15th, 16th. Do you think it was just I've had enough, I need to get out of this? Just so gutted that had happened.
I think that I don't know if the damage was enough, because obviously in some cases when the tire is in the shape it was, and my girlfriend was like, "Oh my goodness," when she saw the tire, because I don't think she's ever really seen something like that before. But when a tire's in that situation, sometimes it can damage the floor, and you can lose a lot of performance because of floor damage. I think Perez probably could have finished top 5 today if he hadn't had the floor damage that he apparently had. So that's just an example of that, but it's really strange from Lando's perspective. But as somebody, I would compare, as you said about the tension, I'd compare it to the anxiety sort of thing where it's you're calm and then you sort of get to a build up point, And then you have, your anxiety attack, and then you go below the line that you were in before, and it's a bit like that with Lando. The Spain, not winning in Spain, and struggling in the sprint to get past Piastri, being outqualified by 4/10 from Max. I think that all was just like, I mean, I think that he was really far too aggressive, but I think the reason why was because in the sprint wasn't aggressive enough.
Hmm.
And so I think he felt mentally in the back of his head, he was thinking, I need to be more aggressive now than what I was like in the sprint, because not being aggressive in the sprint is what costed me. And as I said earlier about the whole Senna thing, he adapted that sort of Senna style of either you give me the position or we both crash.
Yeah.
And Verstappen adopted the same thing. They both basically adopted that thing. I remember Martin Brundle said that about Senna, where he said that either he was basically giving you the choice, and that was either you crash, you both crash, or you give him the position. And they were both acting like a bunch of Sennas, really.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It was going to come to a head. They smashed into one another, ruined the Grand Prix. I think that's a really good point, though, that you make about Lando Norris, because he tried to make that overtake in the sprint and then obviously lost the position to Piastri. And that would have been in the back of his head, the fact that he probably should have won the sprint yesterday. There was so much talk about him winning in Spain. I hadn't actually thought about that. The fact that he lost out to his teammate in the sprint then probably got in his head as well. And we saw that last year in Qatar, where Piastri obviously picked up that sprint victory, and it was like, oh, Piastri's got a win before Lando Norris in Formula One, even though it was just a sprint. But again, that was kind of in his head, because you can see that in Miami when he did finally get that win. He was just so relieved more than anything else to get it. But a little bit of a shame for Lando Norris, kind of frustrating for him. And Max Verstappen did continue, though. Max Verstappen finishing in 5th place. Not the points he would want, but 10 points added to his championship bid. Like, it is the point, like, Max Verstappen, to an extent, can kind of be that little bit more aggressive. I know that this was a bit too much. I think this was more Max Verstappen kind of 2017, 2018, where he was really a bit too
Yeah,
much.
and
But
also, maybe a couple glimpses from 2021 as well, and
yeah, that's true.
put in there. Maybe a little bit of 2021 spice in there. Somebody saying in the comments about MVLH in Brazil and Abu Dhabi.
Mhm. Yeah,
Because obviously,
Max
yeah,
Verstappen loves a battle, but also is right on the edge, isn't he? He's got that bit about him where if it is a car that is equally competitive, we saw him and Lewis Hamilton come to blows a good couple of times in that season. It's a good one to kind of point at. If Lando Norris is now kind of, to put in that Lewis Hamilton slot, let's say, I know that the championship probably isn't up for grabs, but wins
yeah.
definitely are. If Lando Norris is now that car that is closest to Max Verstappen often, do you think this is the last time we're going to see these two collide this season, or is that going to be a
Absolutely.
recurring theme?
I think that they'll talk it out, but incidents happen in racing, and sometimes one driver's to blame, sometimes the other one's to blame, sometimes both are to blame, like in this
Hmm.
situation. And I think it's very, very difficult for drivers not to, when they're on the limit, and when all the adrenaline's going through their body, it's very difficult for them to make those decisions and make sure that they don't crash into each other.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can lead to very, very dire consequences, friendships being lost, and all sorts of other things. And they are going to crash again, whether it be this season or in another time, because that happens in racing. You can't expect everybody to be clean all the time. Everybody makes mistakes. We're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing with Max. We see both sides of the coin sometimes. I'm always so full of praise for Max Verstappen. I think he's such an incredible driver. And I think, we saw that on the Saturday when he came into qualifying, putting 4 tenths on everybody else in qualifying. It was just one of those like sublime Max Verstappen performances. But then he can get a little bit hot under the collar. And I think that's the to and fro you sometimes have with Max Verstappen, isn't it?
Yeah, Verstappen can sometimes just deliver these performances out the park when he's under pressure, and that's what makes him so incredible, because when he's under pressure, he doesn't bottle. He keeps a level head. And that's something Lando, I think, needs to work on a little bit more.
Mhm.
But everybody needs to work on, I think, it depends on what situations you're in, the experience you have,
Yeah.
whether or not you've been in that position, whether or not you bottle it, of course. And I think Max's psychological mind is much better than Lando's is, and I would argue that's because of his childhood, but we won't talk about that.
Go all the way
Yeah,
back to Jos
yeah.
Verstappen. Well, you can talk about Jos Verstappen. He's always in the news, isn't he? But I think we should move on to the actual race result. We haven't mentioned the race winner yet, as much as like it's one of
Well,
those things.
yeah.
We usually start these kind of discussions about the race with the race winner, but there was so much going on between Norris and Verstappen. Let's talk about George Russell. He actually did pick up the victory. His first victory in a couple of seasons, 2022 Brazil, the last time that we saw a Mercedes on the top step of the podium. It wasn't,
Yes.
necessarily a deserved win. Okay, you didn't have the pace of Max Verstappen and Lando Norris, but if the door's going to open, you've got to step through it, and George Russell was there.
Exactly, he did, and that's what makes him. I think like the best way to put it is, you barely saw him at all after Hamilton. He dropped ahead, he got ahead of Hamilton. You barely saw him at all, and he was just sort of working in the background, as in he was keeping that third place. And he probably, because of the gap he had, I don't know if he had a massive gap or not, but he was probably watching Lando and Max's battle on the TV screens when he was driving by and thinking, okay, maybe I can pick something up here. And his engineers would be telling him, they're battling really, really hard. They might collide. They're probably going to collide at some point. You've
Yeah.
just got to capitalize on it when it comes. And, George put himself in that position. And, people will say, oh, he got lucky. But the thing is, sometimes you have to write your own luck, and he did that by keeping himself clean, making sure he didn't get involved in incidents, keeping within the track limits, and keeping himself in that position. And hats off to Mercedes for, putting their car back at the front where it should probably be, being able to, have themselves in that position if an eventuality like that happens. So fair play to George and fair play to Mercedes for that.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of have been saying this about Mercedes a few times over the last few years. They do seem quite good at that kind of damage limitations, often put themselves in the right position at the right time, not necessarily having the fastest car. You look at last season, the fact that they finished second in the constructor standings, that wasn't because they had the second fastest car. Like most of the weekends, they were just picking up those fourth place, fifth place, sixth place finishes, and they accumulate over the season. When you have Ferrari throwing points away or McLaren throwing points away, they just kind of did it. And George Russell's been great at that this season. For me, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, because George Russell's one of those contentious characters. Obviously, came into Formula One, a lot of positivity around him, a lot of people calling him like the next Lewis Hamilton, the next Mercedes world champion, etc., etc. But then there's been a few, I know that everyone points to Singapore last year. I think that we can put that beside. But Canada also this year. Where do you rate George Russell? Do you think he's right up there? Is he ready to like step on if Mercedes do deliver a world championship winning, like capable car? Or do you think he's still just that little bit off the pace?
I think that last season, and I was thinking about this while you were mentioning about the Mercedes consistency, because Hamilton last season was phenomenal. Russell had a very challenging season, and I don't know if that played on his psyche or not. But this season he's been very good. As regards to him having the potential to be a world champion, I think that the potential is there. Just as the potential is there for Leclerc and for Lando Norris as well. But it's about whether or not he can deliver in those environments. Now, because Lewis is going to Ferrari, he can now be that number one driver. Now, we don't know who's going to be in the other seat, but apparently it's going to be Kimi Antonelli, which I think is a big mistake because he's way too young and way too inexperienced, in my opinion, anyway, as somebody who's watched feeder series for quite a long time. In terms of my life, it's been quite a long time. A man of only 16 myself, but yeah, I think that he now has the opportunity to be the team leader. He stepped into that role at Williams, and I mean, I think that he was part of the reason why they were able to, get back up there. I mean, his performances alone put them up in the constructors in 2021, as well as Latifi getting points in Hungary, which was because of the chaos.
Yeah.
So I think that George does have the potential to be a team leader, but whether or not he can do it in a big team,
Hmm.
that's the question.
Yeah.
Because he is, as J-Light says in the comments, he is mistake prone. He does bottle under pressure. You know, Imola in 2021, I think it was.
Yeah.
You know,
Another one, of course. Yeah.
you know, there's been several instances. In fact, his first points finish was Hungary, and then obviously you had Spa with the wet
Yeah.
qualifying. So it's about whether or not he can deliver under pressure. And as you said, Canada, he bottled it while battling with Lando. Um, and I don't think he would have won that race anyway, because I think
No. No.
Lando and Max
Yeah.
had more pace than he did. But today it was different because he was able to put himself in as you say, you know, he opened the door and he, you know, you got to take that opportunity, and he did. So I think maybe, but time will tell, I suppose.
Yeah. It's still. I agree. I think it's still just, which is kind of mad to say considering how long he's been in Formula One. But I think those years at Williams, almost as much as he was gaining Formula One experience, we didn't really get to see him develop in that same way because there was no battling between them and the other teams. So the door's still, obviously, you know, Lewis Hamilton hasn't won any races since 2022. George Russell's got a couple of wins. You got to give him his credit where credit's due. He's been there and he's been the driver to take that opportunity kind of when it was there for him. But I do think today, even though George Russell got the win, there were a couple of drivers for me that probably could have got it. And I'd like to get you to think about this because Oscar Piastri came home
Yeah.
in second place. Oh, if he has got to be looking at that qualifying lap and thinking, I was what,
That
10 millimeters away from a possible Grand Prix victory here. Because it was so close. And in fact,
Yeah,
before the start of the race, I was even arguing that he didn't really gain an advantage because he dipped his car into the
exactly.
gravel. So
Yeah,
whether or not
exactly.
that should have been given.
The whole point of, in my opinion, the whole point of the gravel trap is that it does limit track limits, and I feel like the whole track limits things are just they're a bit like handballs in football, in my opinion. It's gone overboard in terms
Mhm.
of, now. Obviously, I'm a Germany fan. I'm part German, but you know, the handball in the game yesterday between Germany and Denmark, that was a little bit auspicious, and I would compare that to the track limits in F1 because there is way too much policing on it, in my opinion. Unless they clearly go off track and they gain over, you know, maybe 1 or 2 tenths, and they shouldn't be penalized. I mean, I'm just seeing on screen now, you know, that you're not gaining any time from that. You're losing time because he's on the gravel track.
Yeah.
So giving him a penalty for that is just, I mean, I know, you know, you have to be the same for every driver, but that's just ridiculous, in my opinion.
Mm.
You know, I love good hard racing, but that's just that's not what racing's all about. You know, racing's all about perfecting your laps, even if, you know, it means you're going off the track by like a millimeter. You know?
That's the thing, right? So he, like, you can't even really tell that he's off the track from the onboards. It is like the
Exactly.
offboards. Obviously, they have the automatic sensors now, which tell them that they're off the racing line. But with the gravel trap there, it does feel like he didn't gain too much advantage. And Oscar Piastri coming home in second place, he was only a couple of seconds off Russell. Again, it was kind of that thing with Piastri where it was like in the middle stint, especially as his tires were wearing away, it did feel like, okay, he's kind of stuck where he is now. I think he was always going to catch Sainz. Russell, and with Piastri, there was obviously the virtual safety car. I don't know. I'm trying to find something to kind of point Oscar Piastri into that kind of victory position, but I think it was the qualifying, wasn't it? He'll look back at the qualifying as the
Yeah.
main thing. Of course, there'll have been a couple of bits and pieces that he could have done in the race, but that millimeters is what makes the difference. And that's what we want Formula One to be, right? The fact that there are so many drivers right up the top, really competitive with one another, that interchange of positions, like that is what we want to see. The fact that that tiny little millimeter margin is the difference. And George Russell, got to hand it to him, started on the second row of the grid, did really well, deserved the victory over Oscar Piastri.
Yeah, I think that the VSC did have a part to play because that meant that Oscar effectively lost a lap where he could catch. But even then, you know, you could have added 4 or 5 laps on, you probably still wouldn't have caught him. He was catching him, but not enough.
Yeah.
to have beaten him on the day. And fair play to George again for being in that position. And I feel for Oscar because he was that much away, as you said, to winning.
The other driver that I think could have won, and it seems a bit weird because obviously Carlos Sainz finished in third place. I don't think Carlos Sainz was ever really in contention for victory. I do think Lewis Hamilton could have won this Grand Prix had that first stint gone slightly differently. Because obviously he got around the outside of Carlos Sainz at the beginning, and it was like, oh, okay, so now Lewis Hamilton is up behind his teammate, and he was battling with George Russell. Then he had to give that position back. Then he also made the mistake where he went over the pit entry line and got that penalty. And it was just like, on a different day, Hamilton gets past Carlos Sainz early, is battling with George Russell, and maybe comes out on top in front of his teammate. Like, he was in front of his teammate for a very, very small amount of time, but he was in front of George Russell for that moment. Lewis Hamilton could have been looking at a Mercedes victory, and something that we haven't seen from Lewis Hamilton in a very long time.
I think that it's a bit like that old adage, isn't it? About the old De Campo quote of if my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike. Because there's so many if buts and maybes.
True.
And I think that Lewis is he did have a bit of bad luck. And I think he could have gotten a podium, but I don't know if he had the pace to win, because I mean he was really close to George at the start, and he probably would have passed him. And then obviously he had to give that back the position to Sainz, and that was perfectly understandable that he had to do that. I think Russell was able to keep himself consistent on that set of tires, and that is what was the difference between him and Hamilton. Plus, I think George did have more pace than Lewis over the course of the whole race, because they started the race on mediums, didn't they?
Yes.
And I think that maybe Lewis might have had a bit more pace in the mediums. He was struggling a lot more on the hards than George was, and that was, I think, the difference between the two of them.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as well that Russell kind of did the opposite in the middle stint, kind of went medium, medium, hard, whereas a lot of drivers went medium, hard, medium, and that also played into Russell's hands a little bit, because in that second stint, he was able to kind of keep the hammer down a little bit more than the rest, who the hard compound tire just didn't quite look as racy as the medium, obviously so, but it looked like quite a deficit. And we had lots of teams on the radio sort of saying, we want to be on the hard compound tire, but for as little time as possible, because the medium tire just looks so much quicker in terms of the out and out pace that you can get from it.
Yeah, exactly. I think like the biggest way to put it is that Mercedes and McLaren were quite good on their tires. In particular, the gap between Russell and Hamilton on mediums was less than the gap between Russell and Hamilton on hards. Because Lewis, I think, was a little bit quicker on the mediums, but George was quicker on the hards, and that was the difference between the two of them.
Yeah. And again, like, I'm clutching at straws, but I do think George Russell deserved this victory. I just think Oscar Piastri, Lewis Hamilton on another day maybe could have been in there. Although, of course, it should have been Max Verstappen or Lando Norris taking home the victory. It's just the two of them took themselves out of that equation and allowed George Russell that opportunity. In terms of Carlos Sainz, we kind of touched upon him momentarily, but a third place finish for him. Where does this kind of stand for Carlos Sainz now? He's in a very odd position at Ferrari, obviously, still looking for a seat for next season, continuing to show his quality though, has picked up a victory this season, has been in and around the podium places, again picks up a podium for the team here on a weekend that didn't look amazing for Ferrari. I would say they looked like the fourth fastest team overall. And it was, I don't know where Carlos Sainz is right now in his career. He's in just a very awkward position.
I think he's biding his time. He's waiting, and it's like trying to get that perfect timing. But I think that it'll be hard for him to be able to do that now, because so many people are talking, and different seats are getting offered. And if he waits around too long, then the teams are gonna be like, okay, right, we're not gonna sign with you because you're taking too long to answer.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when your friend ghosts you for a few days, and they don't give a reasonable explanation as to why. It's a bit like that, I suppose. And I think that he's 15 points behind Charlotte at the moment in the standings. They've both had a win this season, but I think Charles, I think that he does deserve a big C, of course,
Yeah.
but I don't know if I don't know where he would fit because so many things are happening right now that I don't know where would be good for him for next year because obviously long term there's Audi and all and the rest of it, but in terms of next year, there's not really any seats which are open. It's
Mhm.
about, he's gonna have to, and you got to remember, the guy's, he doesn't look it, but he's 30 in September. He's not got, he's got like maybe maximum, if he's like a Fernando, but I don't think he will be. Another 10 years in F1, but I don't think he'll be another 10 years. I think more 5 or 6 maybe. In those 5 or 6 years, he's got to be able to be in a competitive car consistently, which can be at the front. He's got to be beating his teammates, whoever that may be in the future. I mean, that could be somebody who's not even in F3 at this point. He's got to have specific things to make sure he can be in that spot.
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at Max, he's had the car built around him. He's got a teammate who's not as quick as him. He's got the best car, and he's got the ability. It's about whether Carlos has the ability and whether or not all those things can fall into place for him.
Yeah.
Um, and as for the teams, I mean, I don't know personally what he's going to go for. Apparently, Williams and Audi are probably the main two that are on the table at the moment. If I was him, I would go to Audi because
Okay.
the long-term project there is a lot better than at Williams because they've got more funding
Yeah.
and they've got the backing of a manufacturer. Whereas Williams is an independent team. They used to be a privateer. And, I think I'd much rather be in a factory team than in a privateer team,
I do like asking
even if it
that
was a little bit
question
slower in the short
to
term.
to, to different guests. Like, I think I've asked 3 or 4 people now where they think Carlos Sainz should go, and they've given me 3 or 4 different answers. Interesting that you're in the kind of Audi camp for that, because a lot of people have said Williams, Alpine also kind of joining the mix right now. But yeah, it's definitely a bit of a weird one um, for where they are right now. Bringing up Charles Leclerc there, his teammate. I don't know. We were saying before we started recording, has he made some kind of deal with the devil at some point? Because
Yeah.
obviously he got that victory in Monaco, and it was like Charles Leclerc's back. Charles Leclerc is the second fastest driver. Is he going to be the man to start battling with Max Verstappen? And since then, Canada was horrendous. Spain was okay, but he didn't have any real pace there. And then this weekend goes into the first corner. Piastri on one side of him, Perez on the other side, nowhere to go. And we've seen that quite a lot in Formula One recently, or maybe it's just because it keeps coming up. I'm sort of making that connection where 2 cars either side going into a corner. There's not space for 3 of you. And unfortunately, because Charles Leclerc's the furthest back, I think he tries to duck out of it. His front wing just clips Oscar Piastri. And then that's kind of race over by the time you've got to turn 1, isn't it?
Yeah, he was a meat in a Subway sandwich, effectively. He was. It's difficult in that situation to blame somebody because obviously it's a first lap incident, and perhaps one of them doesn't know where the other one is because obviously they're so focused on being up ahead, and they might have been in a blind spot. I'm talking about it as if they're on the highway, but anyway, it's I think that I do feel for Charles because he could have had a chance at points and maybe a podium today. But what's quite crazy is that in the last couple of rounds, he's only scored 2 more points than Nico Hulkenberg has, which is
Yeah.
which is quite mental, which is quite mental to think about in the last few rounds. And actually, Hulkenberg's been more consistent than he has. Um, but obviously, I'm comparing two completely different situations here. I mean,
Mhm.
Canada was a nightmare, as you said. Then Spain, Ferrari have just sort of lacked the pace. I think since Mercedes brought those upgrades, Ferrari have just sort of immediately after Monaco, they've not improved. And Formula One is a sport where you have to improve, otherwise you're gonna fall off a cliff. I mean, look at Aston Martin. They started the season comfortably in fourth, and then well, I wouldn't say comfortably, but they were in fourth. They weren't anywhere near the top three, but they were in fourth. And it was after that, the upgrades for Alpine, the updates for RB and Haas's improvements, that they fell, into essentially relevancy.
Yeah.
I mean, when you see Alonso and Stroll on the screen now, I mean, obviously, especially Alonso based on last season, you think, who's that? Because you rarely see them anymore.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Alonso qualified 15th, and, it's been a nightmare for them. But to go back to the original point about Leclerc, I think that, he's just going through a rough spell. And,
Yeah.
every driver goes through a rough spell where, they're either out of form or they struggle for a little bit. And I'm sure he's going to bounce back because the man's mental resilience has improved a lot. Off the track, he's got his mental resilience is better than anybody else's probably, because I mean he's had to go through a lot in his life, a bit like how Max has. Max obviously went through his parents getting divorced and everything and all that sort of thing, and then Charles had to go through a lot of losses in his life.
Yeah.
So he's had to deal with a lot, but it's about on the track. His mental resilience at the start, it wasn't amazing, but it's better now, I think, than it used to be.
No, I think you spot on, and the fact like he did almost save it, got back up to 11th place. It was close. It was close from Charles Leclerc, considering the start that he had. I think he tried his best. Ferrari went for some very odd strategy choices. I think he ended up having 4 pit stops in the end, but was carrying a bit of damage too. Tried his best, and Charles Leclerc will bounce back. I think he is, as you say, just going for a little bit of a rough patch. Interesting that like Sergio Perez, the final driver that we haven't talked about in the kind of top 4 teams, is also seemingly going through that rough patch as well. Although I think the problem for Sergio Perez is it's almost identical to last year in that the first few races were great. Then we get to kind of Miami, Monaco, it starts to ebb away a little bit. And now you're looking at Sergio Perez in the last 3 races has been really poor, in my opinion. Like Canada obviously smashed up his Red Bull, got the penalty for that as well. Spain was a poor like performance. Obviously got up into the points, but you'd expect so much more. And then today again, he's being outdone by a Haas. Like it just doesn't feel like he should be where he is a lot of the time. I know he was carrying a little bit of damage today. I don't know though if that's enough to justify his final finishing position being 7th, which, you add Lando Norris back into that, becomes 8th, and it's, I don't know. Sergio Perez for me is in a very odd position once again.
Yeah, I think that his recent form, as you see, it hasn't been great, and it was a bit like last year. But I think with last year, it was more so Max just turning up the heat, because I remember, I don't know who it was that said it, I don't know if it was Yoss or if it was someone else, but they said that after Saudi Arabia, Max was like, or I don't remember exactly what race it was. I think it was Saudi Arabia. Max was like, yeah, I'm done with being like this, and he obviously put in his insane form. And I think that with this year, it's more so the other teams upgrading, and Perez, okay, he said he has struggled a lot, and it's some of them have been his fault. I mean, today wasn't as much his fault, but he probably still should have done better in qualifying.
Yeah.
With Monaco, that's completely on him. He did poor in qualifying. Canada's on him because he made a mistake. Now, obviously, in the conditions like that, and I'm not saying I could have done a better job. I'm just saying, considering he's in that seat and considering the situation he's in, he probably should be doing better. Especially considering Max was doing so well at the front. Obviously, the car's been built around Max, so it's a bit trickier for Checo. So you should be doing better in Canada. Spain, you should be doing better. Finishing 8th, even when you've got a grid penalty, isn't particularly great. And then today, again, I think that the floor damage did have a bit of a part to play, but he still should be performing better than he has been. And I think this exposes for me 2 things, and that's first of all how much Red Bull are focused on Max rather than on Checo, because the car's been built around Max. But also, Checo's struggled to adapt to the car, because they're 2 completely different drivers. You stick one driver in another, in a car built for another driver, and they're more likely to struggle. And that's what separates the good drivers and the great drivers. An example of that would be 2015. Vettel joined Ferrari. He was in a car built for Kimi, and he finished 3rd in the standings. That's what great drivers do. Whereas, I think Checo's a good driver. I don't think he's ever really been world champion material. I mean, maybe 2012 he had a good season, but since then he's sort of been he's been a reliable midfield runner. And it's difficult a player to make a transition from a midfield team, in football, from a midfield team to a top team.
Yeah,
I think it's the same in
same.
Formula One. Him going from Force India and obviously later Racing Point to Red Bull is a big step up. Of course, you had the whole pink Mercedes thing, but
Mhm.
did better in a team where he was the team leader, where he was, in charge of what was happening in terms of, development and everything. He was the one who was, the driver. He helped save Force India from, going bankrupt in 2018 before the Belgian Grand Prix. I think that Checo works better in an environment where he is the team leader than, the Red Bull environment he's in now, which, Max is the team leader and he's a number two.
Yeah. And I
So,
think that's the thing, isn't it? Sergio Perez is the clear number two, is going to be that way for the entirety of his stint at Red Bull. He's never going to displace Max Verstappen as much as he sort of tried to at the beginning of the 2022, 2023 seasons, like to get close. And we were talking about that possible battle between the two of them in 2023 up until around sort of Miami, Monaco, wasn't it? Where Max Verstappen, as you said, just said, nope, this isn't going to be the case. I'm going to be the clear number one. And Croissant said in the chat, he's 1 second behind Max in qualifying. It's just not where he should be. But let's
yeah,
move on a little bit.
exactly.
We mentioned Nico Hulkenberg, who sneaked in front of Sergio Perez, and Haas. I don't know where that
Wow.
came from, but it was a stunning performance from them. Nico Hulkenberg, for me, might even be driver of the year so far. But I cannot
Yeah,
think of a race where he's just been bad. Like I can think of races where the Haas car hasn't been performing well. I don't know. Maybe I'm just missing it, and maybe recency bias, the fact that he's in the points and getting points fairly consistently. But it does feel like Nico Hulkenberg is always there and thereabouts. Like I remember before this Grand Prix, he'd finished 11th place in 5 of the last 7. So
yeah,
he's
exactly.
been
I mean,
right on the periphery of points, and finally, like, they got their just desserts. And I know that they gain a position because of Lando Norris and all the chaos that happened in front, but even so, Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, apart from the middle stint where they almost took each other out, it was pretty
yeah,
perfect.
yeah. I think that Haas have always done very well in Austria. 2018 they had their best ever finish there, and that was a 4th and 5th. Obviously, Mercedes did double DNF in that race. But Haas have always been very good around Austria. Even the disastrous 2019 season with the whole Billy story drama and everything, and with Rich Energy and everything,
Yeah.
and all the upgrades which were downgrades. I think Kevin Magnussen qualified 6th, I think it was on the grid in 2019. So they've always done very, very well around Austria, considering he qualified 5th. Sorry, it wasn't even 6th, it was 5th, and in the end he started 10th on the grid. I've googled it. And yeah, I think that Haas have always done well around here, but we were not expecting them to be this good. They were absolutely fantastic in my opinion.
Yeah, couldn't say a bad word about them, to be honest with you. I thought they did everything perfectly apart from that almost collision between the two. I think Kevin Magnussen has finally realized he doesn't really. Well, he was playing the team game so much at the beginning of the season. I think he's now sort of said, can I have a go? Can I, have some points maybe myself? But you look at where they are in the standings now, and you talk about the fact that Aston Martin, as you said before, with the 4th fastest car, Fernando Alonso's in a league of his own, like in 9th place in the standings. Nico Hulkenberg is now ahead of Daniel Ricciardo. He's on 14 points. Kevin Magnussen now on 5. It's getting really competitive in that middle pack. And, from Yuki Tsunoda looking like he was pretty much guaranteed that 10th place spot, in my opinion, it's now like Nico Hulkenberg's entered the chat. Daniel Ricciardo's picking up a couple of points here and there as well. It's getting very, very tasty in that kind of midfield battle. For me, Nico Hulkenberg has still been the best overall driver in that pack. But
yeah, I agree with that.
I think it's getting really, really exciting. And then you look at the constructor standings. Haas now on 19 points, RB on 30. And they are starting to reel in the Aston Martin car in front. Do you think that could be a battle? Do you think Haas or RB can actually get anywhere close to that Aston Martin 58 points?
I would like to think that it's not just going to be a 3-way battle, because I like to think that the French bottle jobs themselves, Alpine, I think so long as Esteban Ocon doesn't commit absolute horrible things on his teammate during the race, when they're together on the track like he did today to a degree. I think that Alpine can be in that battle. And it's all about whether or not their upgrades work or not.
Yep.
Because if you look at the recent pattern, Alpine and Haas have done very, very well with their car recently. They've gotten some very good finishes. You know, in Canada, they finished 11th and 12th, and they had that very, very, very cool and different strategy. They're always the radical ones, aren't they? Where, you know, Magnussen and Hulkenberg were running towards the front at one point. Alpine have scored, you know, they've scored points in the last 4 races. You know, and in Canada and Spain they got 9th and 10th. And then there's RB. Now Ricardo's done a better job than Yuki Tsunoda has recently, but they have not been doing as well as they were, you know, at the start of the season. I think that Imola was sort of the last race where Yuki and was comfortably quicker than Ricardo. I think since then it's been a lot closer between the two of them, and Ricardo started picking up more points.
Yeah.
As for Aston Martin, they need to improve and fast, because I saw some comments about Alonso just not having that fire in him. And I can totally see that. There is absolutely no fire in him at the moment, because Aston Martin is not performing very well at all. And they need to improve very quickly. Otherwise, they're going to find themselves in that middle pack battle where we do not expect them to be, considering their performances, you know, in the first half of last season, and how much, you know, has been hyped for this project. I mean, originally it was meant to be a 5-year project. Lawrence Stroll, if you think
Yeah.
Formula One is that easy, then you are an absolute, you know, you are very, very, very underestimating of every other team, because Formula One does not take 5 years to win. Not nowadays. Maybe in the 60s, you know, Jack Brabham won a championship after 5 years, but that's a totally different story altogether. Formula One these days, it's nigh on impossible. Ask Jaguar and ask Toyota and even Red Bull. It took Red Bull until 2009 to win a race. Toyota didn't win a race, and they sunk billions into their millions, hundreds of millions into their project, nearly billions. And Jaguar were a massive failure, even though they were backed by Ford. All of these things, it's so difficult for a Formula One team to come into the sport and do well consistently, you know? And it's very difficult. It's very difficult for Aston Martin, because they need to get their act together. Otherwise, they are going to fall behind in the pack. It's like that good old quote, and that is, you know, Formula One is changing all the time.
Yeah.
Evolving itself all the time. It's a sport which is constantly, you know, whether that be on the track or off the track, teams making upgrades, you know, different personnel changes, driver changes, everything is all happening. And even when you think things are quiet, off the track, they are never quiet, because there's always something going on, whether that be, as I said, upgrades or team moves or personnel changes. And, you know, some people may look at things and think, okay, maybe that's a tiny change, but they can make a big change inside. So I think Aston Martin needs to work on that. They need to make a change, or they need to make an upgrade, and they need to get an upgrade that works. I don't like using the word upgrade, because update is a better word, because upgrade makes I think that they're going to be quicker when they're not always going to be quicker.
Yeah.
And I think they need to bring updates that work, not like the ones that have made them go backwards, because
That was the key
gone
thing,
one
wasn't it,
step
last year?
forward. They got 1 step forward and 3 steps back, you know?
Yeah, that was the thing last year, wasn't it? It was like Fernando Alonso was picking up podiums, and it was like, oh, okay, maybe they're in and amongst the battle, and then they started picking up upgrades that just slowly ebbed away their form towards the end of last season. And then this year, it looks like a similar sort of thing for Aston Martin. Started kind of clearly, quick, just haven't been able to carry that form throughout the season. You see Fernando Alonso finished in 18th place, like just not where you expect him to be by any means, especially when you're looking at Hulkenberg 6th, Magnussen 8th, Ricciardo 9th. As you mentioned, the Alpines is also a very interesting little battle they've got going on, and we'll see that develop, I'm sure. Esteban Ocon, again, similar to the science question I like to ask, now that we know Esteban Ocon's leaving, do you see him sticking around on the Formula One grid? Can you see a slot for him somewhere?
As long as his teammate is half a second slower than him every single race, then yes. Because, like I if he is the number one driver, or if he's comfortably the number two driver, then I can see that happening. But because of how quick he can be on his day, it's very difficult for him to be a number two driver in a team.
Yeah.
So I think that if he was to go to a team, he would have to be the number one driver. And I think that, in my view, based on what I've seen and heard and everything, that Haas is probably the best destination for him, because he will be the number one driver in that environment if his number two is going to be, and this is going to be a quick brag here, the F2 driver whose granddad I know, and that is Ollie Behrman, the man who did very good when he stepped in.
Hmm?
And I think that if he's the number one and Ollie Behrman's the number two, that they can work well together. But then Behrman is going to improve and he's going to get used to the car, and that is when Ocon's going to have a problem, because he cannot help, he magnetizes himself to his teammate's car at 100 miles an hour, and that is never going to work
Yeah.
in Formula 1.
I mean, even today, I
because
think we saw the Alpines. I don't know if they touched. It was very, very close. Like, I've got a still of that incident where Gasly eventually got round the outside, but it did get very, very tight between the two of them. Whether there was like a little bumping of wheels, as you say, Esteban Ocon has he just always manages to rub his teammate up the wrong way, and this kind of incidents between Gasly and Ocon was something that everybody said was going to happen. Alpine said that they were going to be able to control it. They haven't been able to control it. Like, it happens almost every single week now at this point. And yeah,
it's
it's one
like
of those
trying to
things.
control a bulldog. It's like trying to control a bulldog, It's so difficult to be able to tame the tiger, to tame, Formula 1 driver, because when they're on the track, they're all of their common sense gets thrown out the window. So it's very difficult to control that, because it's very difficult to change their mentalities and make them just completely different people and different drivers, because that makes them either better or worse. I mean, we saw with Ricardo at McLaren, apparently, when Horner first signed him, he realized, like, he had picked up loads of bad habits or whatever it was. So it's very difficult for you to be able to do that, and for your driver to perform well, because otherwise, psychological effects are huge there.
And then I think the final thing to kind of mention, Williams, Stake Sauber, nothing really happened with either of them. Kind of another one of those weekends to just kind of chalk up as they were there, but they didn't really do much. Albon did say that he felt like the car was better, like here this year than last year, but the Williams car is still just falling so far adrift of the rest. And then similar to the Sauber car, like, they just don't seem to be able to find any kind of pace at the minute. And Bottas and Joe are just going out there, qualifying in the bottom 5, starting the race from the pit lane, and then not really achieving much when it comes to the Grand Prix either.
Yeah, exactly. I would compare Southampton to be not Southampton, Sauber to be the Southampton of Formula 1. I've thought that for many years, because nobody ever remembers Southampton. I think a lot of people totally forgot they were in the championship in the first place. But anyway, that's football. With Kick Sauber, I think they've put all of their baskets into the next few years, and I feel a tiny bit for Joe. Not that I'm saying he ever should have been in that seat in the first place. When he got announced, I was thinking, what on earth are they doing? This is just for money, because he is not good. He was never good enough for Formula 1. Never, in my opinion. He's more of an IndyCar or a World Endurance driver, a World Endurance Championship kind of driver. He's not a Formula 1 driver. Theo Pourchaire is somebody who probably should have gotten a shot in that.
Yeah.
So I feel a little bit for Joe, because he's not going to be a part of that project, probably. And Bottas, we don't even know if he's going to stay or not. Him and Hulkenberg would be very, very interesting, though, in Audi. But you got to remember, both of these guys, they're in their 30s. Bottas is 34, 35? I think he's 35 in August, I think. By the way, I'm not being weird. I've got photographic memory. I'm not obsessive. And they're not gonna be around forever. And Nico's 36 or 37 now. He doesn't look it, but they're not going to be around in F1 forever, and it's about whether or not they will have time to be able to actually be able to perform. Because as I
Do something.
said,
Yeah.
it doesn't take a week to dominate Formula One. It takes a long time. It takes preparation, the right people, and enough funding. Enough funding that goes into the right places as well. Because if it doesn't go into the right places, then you're just basically wasting money that can be spent in better things and better areas. And just ask Toyota about that. Um, so I don't know if they're gonna stick around for that, if they're gonna be able to do that, but yeah.
No, it's and as you say, like when they're getting towards the end of their 30s, Nico Hulkenberg, as much as I threw praise at him today, I think he was wonderful. You're looking at Audi a couple of years away anyway, and then maybe another couple of years to be moderately competitive. Are you going to have a Nico Hulkenberg in his 40s being the spearhead of your team? Probably not. It just doesn't feel like they really needed a Nico Hulkenberg, but at the same time, I can understand why he's in that team. They need someone else. And I don't think Valtteri
Well,
Bottas is the answer.
yeah, I think I think Bottas, he's a lot more free now, but that means that I think he's just sort of lost the spark and the motivation that he did have before.
Yeah.
I mean, earlier on in the season, I had a feeling he was going to retire because I just don't think he's got the spirit anymore. Him and Alonso in the last few rounds have just not. I don't think they've had any sort of spirit at all. And the thing is, it's not because he's he's not performing, because he
No?
is
Yeah,
he
he's
is
been...
he has been pretty good, I think, in terms of when the car has been there, he has been doing quite a good job, but the car is just absolutely dreadful. I mean, whoever designed it needs to go back to designing school probably, because I mean, the car is so slow, and the updates, they're not doing enough with updates. I mean, yeah, it's not good enough,
I think the thing with
in my
Valtteri Bottas
opinion.
as well, kind of like you say, like that spark, it's so difficult when he was at the top team. I mean, he was at Mercedes, he was winning races, they were winning constructors championships, and then you're on your way down again. Like the likelihood of him going back to a Mercedes, a Red Bull, a Ferrari is zero, isn't it? He knows that he's on that decline, on the way back down. And I know it's a very easy comparison to make, but Kimi Räikkönen is the one for me, right? Like left Ferrari, went to Alfa Romeo, and well, you just said Formula One became a little bit of a hobby for him more than actually just driving around and wanting to win
Yeah,
races. I think Valtteri Bottas is almost getting towards that similar kind of vibe where it's like he is a Formula One racing driver, but he likes the other things a little bit more. You see him cycling all the time. You see him doing different brand deals, and he should do. He's enjoying his life. He's getting out there. He's doing the things that if you were given the opportunity to, I would definitely do the same. But he's not that like focused on Formula One, driving in the simulator as much as he possibly can, wanting to be that world champion anymore. Because I think he knows he's kind of on the way out, isn't he, in comparison.
yeah.
But as you say, he's still doing a good job as Valtteri Bottas, and I still think if he was picked up by another team next season, would still do a pretty good job. And I think
Yeah.
he's just kind of getting towards
And
the end of it.
I think the main reason, and I think the main reason why Audi elected to pick Hulkenberg was for the brand,
Yeah.
because Audi are a quintessential German brand. Not talking about the fact that all their cars are produced in the Czech Republic, but they are a very patriotic brand. They are very German. Their motto is Vorsprung der Technik. That's literally that's German. They're a very proud to be a German brand, and them having a German driver perfectly fits that. That's exactly why they wanted to have Nico, I think, more so than anything, because there isn't any German driver in the world at the moment that's got the talent that Nico has. He's the best German driver in the world, which is quite crazy to think about, considering the man is he's not gotten a single Formula One podium, but he's won Le Mans. He's won Le Mans though,
That's
so
true.
fair play to
Yeah.
him for winning Le Mans. Um, and yeah, I think that it's going to be interesting to see how Audi do with him, and maybe it'll be Bottas, maybe it'll be somebody else. I don't know who it's going to be, but whoever it is, they're going to have to stick around for a long time and have the patience of a saint, because
Yes.
it's going to take a while for that team to get to where it wants to be. It's taken Aston Martin a long time to get where they've wanted to be. It was, their third season where they started to do well. And then, even now they're in the midfield. So it's going to take a long time, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think Audi coming in and expecting to be right at the top end of the grid, I think is a little bit of a dream that might not come true for the Audi team. And sort of that's why they haven't been able to, I think, not convince Carlos Sainz just yet. But that's sort of for another time. Thank you so much for joining me, mate. The Austrian Grand Prix turned into an absolute banger of a Grand Prix towards the end, especially for Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. But George Russell taking the victory, Piastri on the podium, Sainz on the podium. Obviously, if you have enjoyed Liam on the podcast, then make sure that you hit that link in the description. He is linked down there. As I said, Liam is the man that knows more about Formula One than I think anybody I know, which is just Thanks. Especially if you're into the kind of your old school 70s, 80s, 90s. Like your knowledge of the 90s is just magic. It's just one of those things.
I like to consider my prime to be 60s and 70s stuff personally. I actually think the 90s is when I start to actually fall off in terms of knowledge. Because
I think maybe it's just because I know a little bit about the 90s as well, where I can be like, I know that as well.
You relate. Yeah. It's been an honor. Thank you very much. And Liam Talks Motorsports, the channel name. And yeah, when I'm not procrastinating, I try my best to upload historical content.
Thank you so much for joining me, mate. We'll be back once again. Subscribe to this channel. We'll be back for the Silverstone Grand Prix in a week's time. Like, there's no rest in Formula One right now. Back at Silverstone, I'm live for qualifying and the race as well.